The senator from Kentucky.
There's probably no greater issue before Congress at any time in our lives or any time in our service than whether or not we should go to war. And I think it's a mistake to slide into war. I think it's a mistake to allow the power to declare war to devolve to one person. Our founding fathers were very, very clear throughout the Federalist Papers, explicitly in the Constitution, that the power to declare war shouldn't go to one person, that the power to declare war should be determined by a vote of Congress. We've abdicated that role, and the vote today is a vote over whether or not we should try to reclaim that power. Now, some will say, well, it's just arms, and if we don't sell them, somebody else will. Well, you know, I don't think of national security as a jobs program. I don't think of whether we create jobs here at home. I think about the young man who lives down the road from me who lost both legs and an arm, okay? I think about the human toll of war. I think about whether or not there is a national security interest, but I think nothing at all about whether any jobs are created. If we make weapons and we have a weapons industry, that's good for our country when we make them for ourselves. But when we're selling weapons around the world, by golly, we shouldn't sell weapons to people who are not putting them to good purpose. What we have found is that Saudi Arabia is an irresponsible ally. One of the great ironies that nobody here can quite explain is that this body has voted unanimously to let the people in 9/11 sue Saudi Arabia. So we're going to let the person that we think might have had something to do with Saudi Arabia have more weapons? What kind of signal is that to Saudi Arabia? Would Saudi Arabia be bereft of weapons if we held $1 billion out? No, we've already sold them $99 billion worth. They've got enough to blow up the Middle East 10 times over. I think it might send them a message. You know what? Stop the sale. Send them a message. You know what the message might be? Quit funding madrasas that teach hate in our country. Don't tell us you're going to stop doing it. Saudi Arabia, tomorrow, stop funding madrasas in America that teach hatred, that teach intolerance. Stop putting Christians to death. Stop putting people who convert to Christianity to death. Stop beheading protesters. The one young man that's a protester in Saudi Arabia is scheduled to be beheaded and crucified. Does that sound like somebody that's a great ally with a great human rights record? The young woman who was raped by 7 men, she was put in prison. She was told it was her fault for being alone with the men. She was publicly whipped. Poets have been picked up around the world and brought back to Saudi Arabia to be whipped for what they write. You trust Saudi Arabia to do the right things with your weapons? These weapons are owned by the American taxpayer. We built them. We did the research into them. Private companies make money off of them, but it isn't about them making money. It isn't about them getting to sell the weapons instead of Russia selling the weapons. It's about our national security. Saudi Arabia's indiscriminate placement of weapons into the Syrian civil war has led to the rise of ISIS. ISIS grew stronger as Saudi Arabia was supplying weapons to al-Nusra and al-Qaeda, and some of them likely to ISIS. We now have a war in Yemen. And yes, we are directly involved in the war. And yes, this is a vote not just about weapons. This is a vote about whether we should be at war in Yemen. We are refueling the Saudi bombers in midair. Our military planes are, in a sophisticated fashion, refueling their planes. Do you think the Yemenis think, oh, no big deal? You know, 3,000 citizens have died. When you go to a wedding in Yemen and you get a bomb dropped on you from Saudi Arabia, do you think you have warm, fuzzy feelings for our great ally, Saudi Arabia? Absolutely, we should be telling Saudi Arabia what to do. These are our weapons. You know, the only way they'll listen is when we argue from a position of strength. You know what is the ultimate weakness? give them what they want, give the arms industry what they want, is the ultimate weakness. We look weak and we look bowed before and cowed before the Saudi Arabians. As they sit back in their long robes sipping tea, refugees bob about the Mediterranean. People are starving and displaced in Yemen, and not one of them will come to Saudi Arabia. Not one of them will be allowed in the country. So yes, this is a debate about war, and this is a debate about whether you want to be at war in Yemen. It's not just a debate about sending and selling another $1 billion of weapons. It's about should we be at war in Yemen. It's about should we be at war anywhere without the permission of Congress. This is not a small occurrence. This is not a small happening. This is a big deal. This is the most important vote that any legislator will ever have. Should we be at war or shouldn't we be at war? And those who want to make this about a jobs program, about we're going to get some sales of tanks, no, it's not a jobs program. It's about young men and women dying in a war. And it's about whether it's in our national interest. It's about whether we are going to be safer. Shouldn't we have a debate over whether or not the war in Yemen is making us safer? We certainly should have had a debate about the war in Libya. Did that make us safer? Once Gaddafi was gone, chaos ensued. ISIS controls a third of Libya after the war, as a result of the war. We are now bombing in Libya. We are bombing the replacement to the government we bombed. So we bombed Gaddafi into oblivion. The people that replaced him we don't like either, so we're bombing them. Does anybody think that maybe it's a mistake? That's what this debate is about. What should American foreign policy be? Should Congress lay down and be a lapdog for the president? Let him do whatever he wants? That's what a vote on this will mean. If you let the president have what he wants, if you let the arms industry have what they want because they can make a buck selling tanks into a war that is a catastrophe. Simon Henderson wrote in the Wall Street Journal, he said that the chaos and violence in Yemen is such that it would be an improvement to call it a civil war. It is hard to know who is friend and foe. Even our former ambassador to Syria has said in Syria, it's almost impossible to know friend from foe. But people have written repeatedly that Saudi weapons in Syria have gone to the wrong people. It's not like, whoops, Saudi Arabia is sometimes wrong and they're not that bad. They have a horrific human rights record. There are people who believe them to be complicit in 9/11. This body voted unanimously to let the 9/11 victims sue them, and now this body wants to give them weapons? Does no one sense the irony? So as we move forward on this vote, everyone should understand that this is a proxy vote for whether we should be at war in the Middle East, because neither side, the leadership on neither side, will allow a vote on whether or not we should authorize force. Neither side will let the constitutional debate occur on whether or not we should be at war. I see my colleague from Connecticut. Would you like to have the last word?
I thank the gentleman.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Madam President. I do think this is an important moment. And as I said in my opening remarks, I don't think that a vote in favor of this resolution fundamentally breaks the alliance with Saudi Arabia. They remain an incredibly important partner. We will still cooperate with them with respect to other counterterrorism measures. We understand the important role that they play in the Middle East with respect to providing some sort of detente between Sunni nations and Israel. But friends also have the ability to part ways. Friends have the ability to call each other out when their friend isn't acting in their interests. And as we have talked about over the course of the last few hours, there is no way to read the war in Yemen as in our national security interests. There's no way to understand how the growth of al-Qaeda and ISIS inside Yemen as a result of a bombing campaign that is funded by the United States is in our national interest. And so I hope that we have a good vote on this, because I think it will send a strong message to the Saudis that their behavior has to change. But I hope that we are able to find other ways where Republicans and Democrats can come together to talk about these issues, because Senator Paul is right. We are not doing our constitutional duty. We are not performing our constitutional responsibility when we acknowledge multiple conflicts in the Middle East that are unauthorized today, when we don't come to the floor of the United States Senate and do what we used to do, which is debate matters of war and peace. And maybe war looks different today than it did 20 years ago or 50 years ago or 100 years ago when conventional armies marched against each other. But this smells, this looks, this sounds like war. We are providing the ammunition. We are providing the targeting assistance. The planes couldn't fly without U.S. refueling capacity. We may not be, American pilots may not be actually pulling the trigger to drop the bombs, but we're doing pretty much everything else that is necessary for this war to continue. Sounds like we should have a say as a co-equal branch, as the Article I institution, as to whether this is in U.S. national security interests or not. And at the very least, by saying that it's time to put a pause on these arms sales, which, by the way, are happening at a pace that is unprecedented. Unprecedented levels of arms sales, not just to Saudi Arabia, but to the region at large. By saying it's time to put a pause on arms sales, then we send a strong message to our ally, Saudi Arabia, that if the conduct of this war doesn't change inside Yemen, if their continued export of Wahhabism to the world doesn't change, then we all have to rethink this partnership. Friends occasionally disagree. I think this is in a moment of important disagreement. This doesn't fracture the partnership with Saudi Arabia. Ultimately, it may make our partnership stronger. And I thank Senator Paul for leading this, and I'd encourage my colleagues to support this resolution.